now I want to come on in the last minutes we've got to look at how we can become the most generous people. What steps can we take? And I couldn't think of a better acronym than this. We've got to learn to be those who plate up. There we go. Plate up, as in buy 30 pizzas instead of 13. Plate up. P stands for practices. There we go. You want to be generous, you have to practice giving regularly and sacrificially or painfully out of what God's given you. It's not about an amount that you have to give. Some of the most generous people I know aren't necessarily the wealthiest individuals, but their generosity is just extraordinary. Often, actually, the wealthier someone is, the less generous they can be. Or they might give a lot away, but proportionally it's less sacrificial and painful, just a thought. Now, as a church, we are committing to do this. It's not like you must do this. It's we are committing to do this, which means that we are wanting to just establish the way that we, plan and pray about our finances. We're wanting to set up larger generosity funds where we can just give more away to people than we've done previously. But it's also something that we as individuals need to practice. And this is arguably the most radical thing that we can do in a society like this. In a society that essentially is built on premises of greed and individual empire building. That's what capitalism is, isn't it? My friend who's an industrial relations expert, he said that the Protestant Revolution was one that essentially taught people to work for the glory of God. But the capitalist revolution was a revolution that taught people to work for the glory of self. That's what we do. We work for the glory of self. So the most radical, subversive, countercultural thing that you and I can do is to give sacrificially, regularly. We want to be those who learn the joy of giving regularly and sacrificially. And I'm on this journey too. And this is important for us because you have an enemy and there is a god of wealth at work in the world, the god of mammon, Jesus calls him. And every time you're given a pay packet of some kind, he whispers in your ear. And he whispers to you saying, this is where security is. This is where joy is. And so we pursue it. I want to do an extension on my house. I need a bigger, better car. Those things aren't bad. I want. And though not bad, the whisper that gets in is, you can trust me for your security more than you can trust God. Now, last week I even confessed, at the end of the service, I confessed I struggle with a fear of poverty and a fear of lack. Struggle to trust God. I'm on this journey. And it strikes me that many people in the West do have this mentality of lack, that there's not going to be enough. And it just strikes me that's odd, considering that we are the wealthiest, healthiest people that have existed on planet Earth and are in the top 5% wealthiest people on the planet. And yet we live with this fear of lack. Just submit that to you isn't that curious? We have a God who whispers, the God of mammon whispers and says, you need wealth to be happy, to be secure. So every time you give, which is why regularly giving is important, but every time you give, you stick a heart in that mammon God and you crush him and you say, I will not listen to that. I will learn to trust God. And then when you get paid again, mammon comes back to life and he whispers again. And so we kill him again. That's what it means to be a Christian. It's a violent religion that attacks greed and attacks the lies of the enemy like that. If you want to start giving on a Sunday, there's envelopes at the back. You are welcome to do that. We don't talk too much publicly about this, and we don't pass plates around, and we deliberately decided to not do that because we want people, Christian or not, to come and feel like this. We're not just after your money. But nevertheless, as a Christian, if you're somebody who's wanting to learn to grow in this, giving sacrificially regularly is very important. So again, there's envelopes at the back. You can put the money in the thingy. It's entirely up to you. Thingy. That's not a help clear instruction, is it? There's a tin pot thing at the back. Okay, fine. Now, it's worth saying as well that the first step towards practicing regular generosity is actually learning to manage your money wisely. If you're living chaotically with your money, you can't be generous. In fact, giving generously when your money's in chaos isn't generosity, it's often just recklessness. So we run money management budgeting courses like CAP to help if you're interested. Okay, I need to speed up. So, practice. Next one. Generous people learn to love deeply and hold lightly. Someone shared this with me during the pandemic about just church life. I find it incredibly helpful, so I submit it to you because I think it's useful not just for pastoring, but generally in life. Okay, next slide. we have a quadrant. Everyone loves a quadrant. You have two choices when you meet someone. You can love them deeply, or you can love them superficially. You also have the choice. You can hold on to them tightly, or you can hold them lightly. And it's not just a question with people, but it's also the question with stuff in your lives. You can love deeply, love superficially, hold tightly, or hold lightly. If you love someone deeply and you hold them tightly, don't let them go, that's control. If you love someone superficially, you use them for your own ends, you don't really love them, and you hold them tightly, that's abuse. The goal for the Christian, and for me as a pastor, is to love people deeply, but to hold them lightly. You're free to come and go as you please, but you are loved deeply. But I think that also applies to our stuff, the things that God's given you. You love the things in your life deeply, of course, but hold them very lightly. They're just tools in the master's service. We're to be those who have open hands, not grasping ones. Next one. Simply asks. You want to be generous? You've got to learn firstly to ask God for all that you need. Jesus says, when he taught us to pray, he said, give us today our daily bread. Ask every day for the things that you need. Learning to be generous begins firstly then with seeing that God is the one who meets your needs daily. And many of us will be familiar with a man from Victorian England, George Muller, who established orphanages in Bristol in the 19th century. And he did so on the basis, really, that God answers prayer, that God gives whatever we ask him for. Needs would arise in his life, in the needs of the orphanage, and he would bring them to God on a daily basis, and he would receive answers to those prayers, often at the very time of asking. This became a pattern throughout his life and his testimony. There are stories of sitting down for breakfast with hundreds of orphans and having no bread, no milk, no food for them. And nevertheless, asking, saying grace, and before grace is finished, there was a knock at the door as the milkman passing by says, my milk float's broken down, have all this milk. Or the baker knocks at the door and says, I've been baking all night because the Lord woke me up to bake bread for the orphans this morning. That was the pattern of his life. He learned to ask God for everything he needed, and God gave it to him. But what I discovered recently that really encouraged me was it wasn't just the pattern of his life, it carried on after his life with the orphanage that he established. So he set up the orphanage in whenever it was, in the mid-19th century. He died in 1898, having led this orphanage for over 50, 60 years, as a testament to the glory of God that God gives when we ask him for things. But then listen to this. He says, on March the 18th, 1922, this is now 24 years after George Muller has died and the orphanage has been handed on to the next generation. On March the 18th, 1922, God sent the largest single gift ever to be received in the long history of the work in the form of a donation from the US of $45,000 with a simple statement attached to the money saying, please accept this slight token in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, yours by grace only. Then on the 29th of the same month, another check arrived for $6,000. And then the latest report of the institution was issued in 1939, just as World War II was breaking out. And this report gave the income for the year of 1938-39, showing an income of £34,000, and there was also a balance on hand of £7 and 124 shillings, 9.5 pence. Thus, God, it says, the living God, has been able to supply all the needs of the home. The report concluded with this: without anyone having been personally applied to by us for a donation, £2,369,747, 12 shillings and 8 3/4 pence has been received for the orphans as a result of prayer to God since the work began. When we ask and we pour ourselves on God for his blessing, he gives. We learn to plate up by practicing, by loving deeply, by asking, next, by thanking God. It sounds very straightforward, but thanking God for everything in your life loosens your grip on it, because you begin to realize it all came to me from God. I don't deserve any of it. So we ask God for everything that we need, and then whenever we have something, we thank God for it, and it loosens our grip on things. And then lastly, We learn to become a generous people by encouraging each other. See, the opposite of generosity is stinginess. And we want to learn to be those who are generous with our words of praise and our encouragement. We want to be an affirming, life-giving people rather than a nitpicking people. And we want to learn to be generous even with our opinion of those that we disagree with. A friend of mine is excellent at this. He debates globally with people that he disagrees with, but often he does so in such a way that you can tell he has a lot of respect for and appreciation for the people that he's debating with. How are you with people that you disagree with or who hold different opinions to you? And we live in a very opinionated age. Everyone has an opinion about everything. Learning to hold opinions lightly, but learning more than that, to speak well of the people we disagree with and see their merits rather than just their flaws is very, very important. It's the grace of God. It's the generosity of God. I mean, if you read the back of the book of James, it says, I should read this. It's just, this is amusing. Not amusing. Anyway, it says this. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job and have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. If you've ever read Job, you've learned that he wasn't the most, peaceful, patient type. He was very, up in God's face, wrestling with the trouble that he was facing. And yet God remembers him by saying he was a very steadfast individual. Often you see this in the Bible. The kind of history of heroes of the faith, it emphasizes them and speaks well of them. It emphasizes their good bits and speaks well of them. God is kind in the way that he remembers you and I. He removes your sin from you as far as the east is from the west, and the way that we're to love one another is to speak well of them. So there we go. That's how we can learn to plate up. Practice giving sacrificially, loving deeply, asking God for all that we need, thanking God for everything, and encouraging one another often. But let's be honest, on the journey to generosity, the hardest challenge that you and I face is the internal challenge. Can we trust God to supply our needs? If I was to say to you, would you like to be a generous person? Undoubtedly, we'd all say, yes, please. What stops you and I? Fear, lack, not really wanting to get rid of, holding things too tightly. In Philippians 4, the Apostle Paul says, my God will supply every need of yours. Last week, I read about Roland and Heidi Baker, who saw remarkable, miraculous provision time after time in their lives. To be the most generous people we can be, it requires us to receive from Jesus and then to allow everything that we've received from him to be submitted to him for the adventure he's called us to. In Narnia, the children come across Father Christmas and he gives them gifts that at the time seem a little unusual, but when submitted into the army of Aslan, find a perfect place. All of the gifts that the Lord has given you, he has given you to be used to strengthen and build the community that you're part of, the workplaces that you're part of, the families that you're in. He's inviting you to follow him and to see everything he's given you as a tool in his service to be used on his adventure. Jesus said it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. And I believe he's wanting you and I to discover that to be true.